Okay, well, we'll get going. We have, like I said, a great team, 5 presentations, and we'll just after each presentation, there'll be some time for questions, and then at the very end, depending on the ending time, we'll have some additional time for questions. So let me go ahead and share the slides. Okay, is that showing up on the screen okay?
Yes, it
That's
is.
good, yeah.
Full presentation mode?
Yes.
Excellent. Hey, Tom.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me today. So my name's Tom Webb. I'm a senior lecturer in marine ecology and conservation at the University of Sheffield. We're a research-intensive university in the north of England, and we're actually just about as landlocked as you can get in England. So which means that in practice, I have to drive 50 miles in either direction to hit the sea. So we're quite a narrow country. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that we do in my group here, concerned with large scale and long-term changes in marine biodiversity, and in particular, how we can harness data to try and understand.
Excuse me real quick. Somebody's got their mic open and I feel like I'm hearing a weed eater or something in the background. If you're not speaking, please consider closing your mics. It's overwhelming. I can barely hear Tom.
That's got it, hasn't it? That's gone now. Good. Okay, can you still hear me though? Great. Okay. Next slide, please.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So in my group, we're interested in a series of big questions about marine biodiversity. So my group is the macroecology of marine ecosystems group. And we're interested in questions like, where is marine biodiversity? What are the big spatial patterns in diversity? How does marine biodiversity change through time? And importantly, how do we know this? So what's the evidence that supports these kinds of assertions? Sometimes we even kind of delve into questions about what do we even mean by biodiversity? So what are we measuring? How do we measure it? Where are the knowledge gaps? And how might we go about filling some of these gaps? And then importantly, how do we try to apply this knowledge to inform policy and conservation? Next slide, please. So I guess, as a marine biologist, this is sort of my self-image, and I do get to see, I get to the coast once a year. I run a field course in beautiful North Wales. Next slide, please. And we introduce students to the intertidal zone there, and some of the wonderful biodiversity that we have around the coasts in the UK. But actually, for the bulk of my research, I don't stray too far from my desk. Next slide, please. So the approach that we actually use to try and address some of these big questions is really data-driven. We use a lot of international biodiversity data infrastructure. We develop computational pipelines to try and link and enrich individual biodiversity data sets. And then we apply a range of statistical methods to try to answer these big questions. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I just have a small digression here to illustrate really how far we've come over the course of my career in this kind of data-driven ecology, data-driven marine biology. So I'm old enough to remember these. This is the 3D manifestation of the save icon. So this is a floppy disk, 1.4 megabytes or something like that. And this is what we used, at the start of my career for dealing with data. Next slide, please. You don't have to go very many years forward from using floppy disks to headlines like this. So this is the headline. This is already, by 2018, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility had surpassed 1 billion species occurrence records. And in the years since then, the GBIF has expanded to about 3.5 billion records. The Ocean Biodiversity Information System, which is the kind of marine arm of GBIF, if you like, is well over 100 million species occurrence records. So we are swimming in a sea of data, to the extent that, next slide, please. When I talk to students, so this was a message that I sent my master's student, Emma, last year, when she was in the early stages of planning a project. I said, you know, at this point, just assume that everything is possible. Assume that any data you might possibly want exists. And obviously this is not quite true, but we are really in a rich world of biodiversity data now for tackling the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. Next slide, please. Obviously, data isn't knowledge and understanding, but as this quote from a paper by Feng et al. A couple of years ago suggests, that we can actually rapidly increase biodiversity knowledge by integrating databases together. So next slide, please. In other words, as we link these data sets together and we enrich one kind of data, which might be species occurrences, with other kinds of data, for instance, on the environment they live in, their kind of biological traits and so on, it vastly expands the set of questions we can address with marine biodiversity data. Next slide, please. So we've written about this over the last decade or so, thinking about how we can approach marine conservation in new ways by harnessing existing data sets, scaling up ecological data. This is a review that we wrote, as I say, a few years ago now on this kind of work. And next slide, please. This is a slightly more recent paper looking at how we can link different kinds of data sets, different ways of measuring diversity at a global scale. So all of this work is kind of global in extent and working with really big data sets. But really, for the purposes of today, I wanted to focus in a little bit on European marine ecosystems, the seas around the UK and neighbouring seas as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk you through a case study about using data to better understand the predicament of seabirds in the North Sea. Next slide, please. So seabirds are a really important group of birds. They are one of the most endangered group of birds globally as well. And in the UK, although we are far from a biodiversity hotspot for most groups, we do have really internationally important breeding colonies of a number of seabird species, various species of auk. We've got shearwaters, we've got gannets and so on. So really important breeding colonies of these seabirds. We are also a nation that's passionate about birds, and we are really good at monitoring seabird populations, not just the numbers, but some of the, you know, kind of more in-depth ecological observations of seabirds as well. But it turns out we're surprisingly bad at monitoring what seabirds eat, their key prey species. Next slide, please. So this is Sylvan Benaxas, who was a PhD student in my group. He finished his PhD at the end of 2024, and he aimed over the course of his PhD to try and fill this knowledge gap a little bit. So he was bringing together different kinds of fish survey data sets, all of which had some relevance to the key prey species of seabirds, but weren't directly focused on them, and adding in some environmental data and applying a series of quite sophisticated spatiotemporal statistical models to estimate what the distribution of these key prey species are. And the two key species that he was working on were sand eels and sprat. These are kind of small forage fish, tend to shoal in big shoals, and are, you know, they form the basis of the kind of bait balls that you see on natural history documentaries in the North Sea. Next slide, please. So these are some of the kind of outputs that Sylvan was able to create. These maps here show the estimated sand eel biomass in the North Sea at quite a nice fine spatial resolution. It's a resolution that enables you to pick up habitat features and to see the details of the spatial distribution of this key species for the first time. And also this temporal resolution here. In this figure, we've just kind of aggregated into year groups, but we actually have a finer scale temporal resolution here over the course of 20 years, 2000 to 2020. So we've now got these kind of maps. We've done the same for sprat as well, of prey distribution through space and time for these seabird species. Next slide, please. What Sylvan was then able to do was to combine this new information on seabird prey distribution with some of the really high quality survey data that we have for breeding colonies of some of these seabirds. So this work here focuses on guillemots or common mures, and we have information on what they feed their chicks and how much they feed their chicks. And Sylvan was able to use this information about how much energy it takes to turn an egg into a fledgling guillemot over time, and then relate this to the abundance of sprat and sand eel in the environment. And he was able to show that actually this population of guillemots in near Edinburgh in Scotland has a dependence on sprat now. Sand eel aren't as abundant as they used to be, and the guillemots have switched to sprat. And their breeding success is dependent on having enough food to feed their chicks. And usually this is sprat, but in a year of low sprat abundance, they can switch to sand eels and maintain sufficient provisioning for their chicks to do well. But in years, if there's low sand eel and low sprat, that's when they tend to suffer. Next slide, please. The next step for Sylvan's work was to take this information that we have on where the birds live and where they're foraging and where their food is, and combine it with information on stressors in the environment, various pressures that they're facing, things like increase in sea surface temperature, shipping lanes that might influence their foraging ability. Increasingly in the North Sea, one of the major spatial pressures is offshore energy installations, in particular wind farms. So we can look at the distribution of wind farms, as well as more traditional industries in the North Sea, like fishing, and combine all of these layers together to produce a kind of risk map. Next slide, please. So that's what we have here for 3 species of seabird, kittiwakes, razorbills, and guillemots. In each of these maps, we've got areas which we know are important for the seabird foraging areas. We've got areas where we know there are lots of pressures, and then we've got overlaps shown in orange on these maps of key foraging areas that also overlap with multiple pressures and stresses. And we can look at that in the current situation, and then we have some information on what's happening in the future. So the approved and planned wind farms, for instance, in the future will change the overlap of seabird foraging with stresses as well. And then there are future fishing scenarios as well. In particular, the UK government has sought to ban fishing for sand eels in order to protect the ecosystems. And there is some conflict at the moment with the EU around whether that ban will be allowed to stand. So this is the kind of, the process of going from ecological modeling through to producing these kind of synthetic maps, which we hope are useful for planning, for management of marine ecosystems. Next slide, please. And that's what I want to just focus on for the last part of this talk, which is thinking about this process of turning data into data products which serve management and policy. Next slide, please. So this is work that I've done with EMODNet. EMODNet is the European Marine Observation and Data Network. It's a network of organizations throughout Europe, which is committed to processing data that we observe in the marine environment according to international standards, and making the information freely available, free and fair, as data layers that people can access and as data products. And there are various arms to EMODNet. There's physics, chemistry, human activities, and so on. I've been involved in the biology node of EMODNet, creating biology data products for, I think, getting on for a decade now. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what some of the biology data products look like. In the top row there, we have habitat suitability models for a potentially invasive macroalga species. So again, drawing on occurrence data to model distributions and suitabilities. In the middle row here, we've got some species distribution modeling for a key zooplankton species, Calanus vinmarchicus, which is really sort of fundamental to marine food webs in the Northeast Atlantic. And we can try and model the abundance of that through space and time. And the bottom row shows a sort of community level way of looking at the data here, which is temporal turnover in the communities of benthic macroinvertebrates in European seas. Next slide, please. These data products are made available through a map viewer. So this is all kind of openly available, and you can play around with the data products, put up different layers at the same time, and look at interactions between them and so on through the eModNet map viewer. Next slide, please. But the other really important step that I think we've taken over the course of the time that I've been involved in eModNet is trying to more transparently document what we're doing with the data to produce the data products. So there is eModNet has a presence on GitHub, and all of the individual products have a repository which describes the process of going from raw data through to data product. So there's an audit trail there that is really useful for any potential users of these data products. Next slide, please. So if you want to find out more about this, we've written a recent paper in Marine Policy, which is available open access, which is talking more about these data products and how they can try to help to improve the outlook for marine biodiversity. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize the messages from that paper, there are an awful lot of policies at national and international level looking to reduce pressures on marine biodiversity. A lot of those in the European context have 2030 deadlines. So there's kind of pressing need to address marine biodiversity changes and to evidence the fact that we're doing that. And to create that evidence requires adequate data. Data products are a way of taking some of the complex raw biodiversity data and turning them into a format that's more suitable for management and policy. And that's what we've tried to do in eModNet Biology by producing a number of biology data products to try to support decision-making for marine biodiversity at a European scale. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to sort of sum up the messages from this talk, next slide, please. I've talked to you about how we try to harness data to understand changing seas at a large spatial scale and over long time periods. So our seas are subject to significant and increasing pressures from our demands from them. Basically, we're using our seas to obtain food, to obtain materials, and we are placing demands on them for space, for energy installations, and so on. It's really important that we understand the impacts of the pressures that we're placing on marine environments, of things like incremental climate change, as well as increasingly these sort of more acute marine heat wave events, fisheries, exploitation, offshore energy installations, and so on. What are the impacts of these on marine biodiversity? And in my group, we use data on the distribution and dynamics of marine species at large spatial scales to try to partially address this need. And I just wanted to finish by saying, you know, given this is a sister cities and international meeting today, that the international networks and collaboration across borders is really important, and it greatly facilitates the kind of work that we do. And yeah, so it's been really nice to talk to you about this today. There's contact details for me at the bottom of this slide if you want to get in touch, but I'm happy to take any questions now as well.
I think we have time for a couple questions. Okay, we'll have time at the end as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Exciting. Our next speaker is Keith Nichols.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everyone who's online on this presentation. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I should indicate that I'm actually in another workshop as I speak, and I would not be able to stay on for the full length of this webinar this morning. So I'll do the presentation. If there are any questions, then I will take those. And but feel free, of course, to get through to me if anything further information is required beyond today. So I'm going to be speaking. I'm the head of special projects at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center based in Belize. I am a St. Lucian. I've been here in Belize. So I'm actually now in sitting in St. Kitts at another workshop, but I'm based in Belize now for about 13 years. So a fantastic country, lots of coral reefs, and the world's second largest barrier reef system. A fantastic opportunity for studies and data and everything that was spoken to earlier. So I'll be presenting on the Coral Reef Early Warning Systems network. Next slide. And this was, yeah, thanks, Martin. Next slide. This was triggered by, of course, the recognition by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the US, of the value of coral reefs around the world. And our engagement with NOAA was triggered by the presence of our coral reefs and the threats to coral reefs within our region, from hurricanes, from sea level rise, global warming, and all the other threats that we all should know of so very well. But again, our coral reefs provide support for livelihoods. There's significant economic, ecological, and societal benefits to be gained from our coral reefs within the region, and support many livelihoods, providing food and jobs. And of course, they provide a barrier to some of the storm surges and the other impacts from hurricanes, protecting our shorelines. And so they're seen as strategically important for the development of our economies within the Caribbean. And notwithstanding the fact that there's still some research potential, but can be provided by coral reefs as research into new medicines are ongoing. But the value of coral reefs, I don't think, is clearly understood in some parts of the decision-making world, not among us practitioners, but among those who see the larger picture of economic development globally. Next slide. So we, in partnership with NOAA, established what is called the Coral Reef Early Warning Systems, and we've installed stations all over the world as part of a broad network. But within the Caribbean, we invested in those from 2001, and this is even prior to the 5 Cs established as an operating entity with a mandate to guide the Caribbean's direction in pursuing resilience to the impacts of climate change within the region. So the first systems were stationary pylons, as seen in the middle photograph, and that eventually evolved into floating buoy systems that was used, next slide, to collect data. And I'll speak to what sort of data we're collecting through those in a bit. So this network is designed to collect real-time environmental data from prime coral reef sites around the world. And I'm going to speak primarily to what we're doing within the Caribbean, and to analyze patterns and trends that are impacting or providing threats to our reef systems. Sorry, got some competing activities in the background here. And of course, be able to predict the effects of environmental events on coral reefs, such as bleaching, and spawning and migration patterns. So there's a tremendous value in having those systems in place to enable us to understand what's happening in the immediate environment around coral reefs and impacting coral reefs itself. Next slide. So the key research questions here are: what are the long-term trends of meteorological and oceanographic parameters at the key coral reef areas? Can the data from the various sources be integrated into real time and provide ecological forecasts for management purposes? And to understand what are the key environmental factors relating to coral bleaching, other coral ecosystem concerns, such as adaptation, resilience, disease, spawning, and migrations, as we mentioned earlier. Next slide. So we've installed over the years a series of stations, again, starting with NOAA's engagement in the Caribbean. These were some of the very early stations that were installed, some of which are no longer functional for a variety of reasons. We've had a number of severe storms pass through the region. Do you remember 2017 storms of Hurricanes Maria and Irma, 2019 with Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, 2023 with Hurricane Beryl in Grenada. And these systems will be impacted by those extreme weather events. And we've lost a few of those. There is a management support program in place where, with the new ones, they can be brought in to shore for protection in the event an extreme weather event, an extreme event such as hurricane, the nature of Hurricane Beryl, Maria, Irma are about to strike the islands. Next slide. So these are the new systems, the new design systems. They're heavy, they're expensive, but they're very heavy, and they're anchored to the substrate using a specialized method, as we'll see in upcoming slides. And these collect a number. Next slide. Of parameters, both meteorological and oceanographic. And these are sensors that are installed both above the sea surface and below, collecting some of the information that you see in the slides. And we can add sensors to satisfy the needs of any system or any country for that matter. It's just a matter of having the sensors installed. These systems do need to be maintained because they're stationary, they're subject to fouling by many marine organisms, and they need to be cleaned on a regular basis and taken on shore for regular cleaning and update and manage and updating the software programs as well. So this is some of the information that can be collected through those systems, through the sensors that are installed on the network itself. Next slide. So the process of installing those involves training. It's a very complex system. The software needs to be properly configured. The sensors updated, ensure that they're all working. Next slide. And yeah, so a lot of the work is shore-based installation preparation for deployment on the preferred site. The sites had to be surveyed beforehand, the determine the conditions, the proximity to coral reefs. Next slide. And to ensure that it's easily deployed and can easily be returned to shore in the event of an extreme weather event or for maintenance purposes, for cleaning or whatever. Cleaning can be done in situ, but in the event that we're required to do major upgrades to the system, they can be brought back to shore. And of course, some heavy lifting is required. Next slide. So and this is one being towed out to the site, to the site. There've been a number of coral bleaching events in recent times. We're subject to ocean acidification and increase in surface temperatures and sea temperatures. And we are required to monitor the immediate environment so we can put in place a long-term administrative arrangements for managing or ensuring the integrity of those systems. Because they're a source of livelihoods, and there's tremendous pressure from fishing, for example, or from scuba diving. And our response to extreme events would be either to restrict or zone fishing activities, reduce pressure from the number of scuba divers on those reefs, or whatever's required to help maintain the integrity of those systems. Those systems are under pressure. The coral reefs they're under pressure, and anything we can do to ease the pressure from anthropogenic type activities, we would want to do so. So next slide. So this has been towed out to the sites. Next slide. And we've deployed a number of those across the region. Of course, there's the preparation, lots of materials, bungee type ropes to allow for wave movement once it's anchored in place. Next slide. And in preparation, quite a bit of work to prepare the lines, to get everything in place. We've got drill holes for the anchor system. It's a specialized anchor system. Next slide. We're using either what is called the Hallis or the manta ray system, specialized anchor systems to ensure that under heavy sea conditions, the buoys remain in place and not pulled from the substrate. Next slide. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see the anchor system where this is drilled, cement poured into a very firm substrate right next to the coral reef to ensure that the system is not pulled away from its moorings and it's lost. So the materials used that had to be corrosion resistant as far as possible, notwithstanding the fact that they had to be maintained. There's quite a bit of movement with those buoys, and there has to be regular inspections about the anchor system. Of course, the entire linkage, the floating buoy system itself, to ensure that these are intact and when necessary to change lines and ropes as necessary. Next slide. So we've deployed quite a bit across the entire Caribbean. Again, you will see in the bottom right the iconic PTOS image of the PTOS in St. Lucia, but we've installed in St. Kitts, St. Vincent, a number of other countries in the region. You'll see in the following slide that the number of countries in which, next slide, which we've installed those systems. So there we are. They're functioning systems right now. Notwithstanding the early deployments from 2001, these are the new systems, and we've installed in Belize, Bahamas. There are 2 in the Bahamas. The last one has yet to be installed. There's a bigger story behind that one involving USAID. But we've installed in St. Kitts and Antigua, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenadines, Barbados, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago on the Buckaroo Reef area. And we're hoping at some point in time we can expand the network of coral reef systems, stations within the Caribbean. Working in collaboration with NOAA, that is at a standstill right now for obvious reasons. We won't get into that, but until such time we can re-engage with NOAA in a more significant way, a manner, then we'll be back on stream with the program. But for the time being, we are collecting real-time data from those systems and fed directly to administrators in the countries, and as well to the satellite for broad interpretation of what's happening globally. Next slide. So that's the end of the presentation on coral reefs. I could have loaded more information on what we found so far, but we were still in the relatively nascent stages of installing those reefs, getting the response systems in place from the relevant national authorities. There's a demand for those. The appetite is really, really good. The last station to be deployed, hopefully, will be in Eleuthera in the Bahamas, working in collaboration with the Island School or Cape Eleuthera Institute to manage that particular system. So the project continues. There's still tremendous interest over time. And yes, so there's a question here right now that says, what depths are we installing? We're looking at anywhere about 40 to 60 feet. We're talking anywhere between 20 meters and 25 meters approximately for anchoring the system. They had to be near coral reef areas, and they had to be positioned in such a way that they move with the tide and with waves, and not to provide too much stress on the anchor system itself. So that's it for now. We wouldn't go into details on what we're observing with the ocean, changes in ocean parameters. That has been modeled through a number of programs within the region, but then hopefully the coral reef early warning systems will provide us enough information to satisfy administrative requirements for the necessary actions we need to pursue to protect those reefs. Thank you.
Questions? Well, thank you very much. And your contact information was on the slide, so it sounds exciting system.
Great, thanks, Martin. And yeah, feel free to reach out to us if you need any further information, and I'll be in touch. I do apologize. I do need to run to my other meeting, so let me wish you the best in the rest of the presentation and discussions. Thanks again. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Martin. Thanks again.
Okay, our next presentation is from Ellie Bergstrom. Pass it on.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from San Francisco. Thank you, Martin. Thank you to the Sister Cities Association for hosting this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a marine ecophysiologist by training, spent most of my career thus far working with seaweeds. So let's jump right into it. I will be presenting today on seaweed as a tool for marine carbon dioxide removal. So seaweed are very impressive marine photosynthetic organisms, as we know, that form the biggest and most productive coastal ecosystems on Earth. There's a huge diversity across seaweed taxa, as we've already actually seen in one of Tom Slides from the UK, meaning, being diverse, these seaweeds occupy a range of ecological niches, from being habitat engineers to acting as important primary producers, serving as a source of energy and oxygen to the food web. Seaweed are also responsible for numerous ecosystem services that benefit humans as well. Next slide. This diagram illustrates some of the main ecosystem services offered by one of the most well-known seaweed ecosystems, kelp forests. Kelp are a type of brown seaweed for those that aren't familiar. Yet the services depicted here often apply to many other seaweeds too. So kelp forests are crucial spawning grounds and nurseries, supporting commercially significant species as one of their ecosystem services. They serve as natural coastal protection by buffering the impact of wave action and storms, serving as a barrier to that energy impact. And relevant to this talk, they serve as biological agents in drawing down carbon from surface waters. In fact, at faster rates than most land plants. That's why we have a great interest nowadays in exploring what these seaweeds have to offer. Next slide, please. Seaweed can also be found in the open ocean, which is an important detail to consider when we get to talking about aquaculture and marine carbon dioxide removal. There are only two known species of entirely pelagic seaweed, Sargassum fluitans and Sargassum natans. There are different morphotypes that are identifiable taxonomically, but to keep it simple, talk about those two species. And as mentioned, they pertain to the genus Sargassum. They're often referred to as holopelagic, which means that they spend the entirety of their lives afloat in the open ocean and never affixed to the benthos. There are various other seaweeds, other species of Sargassum included in those, that can be found floating in the open ocean, but it doesn't mean that they're holopelagic. They're actually benthic species that become detached from the benthos at some point during their life cycle and survive afloat for a number of weeks before dying. Next, please. So getting a view of the Sargassum ecosystem, you see in the lower left-hand corner the two species, Sargassum fluitans and natans, the two holopelagic species, right? They're ecosystem engineers forming these transient floating patches and windrows, mostly in the northern Atlantic, natively in the northern Atlantic, as the next talk will get into this a bit more with Julian. They harbor many other species, from nutrient-fixing microbes to attached calcifying bryozoan animals to frogfish even. So the ecosystem services serves as an oasis in the middle of the North Atlantic, like I mentioned, where migratory turtles, seabirds, fishes, eels, and many others can stop for protection and food. The ecosystem even harbors endemic species of crabs, fishes, snails. As you can tell, mentioning all of these organisms, it's very important for global biodiversity. The seaweed patches importantly serve as nurseries for juvenile fishes such as mahi-mahi, jacks, amberjacks, and those are commercially significant fisheries. Next, please. In both coastal and open ocean systems, these seaweeds naturally contribute to marine carbon dioxide removal, or MCDR, which you might hear me refer to it as from here forward, which means that the photosynthetic rate of seaweeds is significant enough to take meaningful quantities of inorganic carbon from the photic zone of the ocean, fix it into organic compounds that make up their bodies, their thalli, and then thus remove that carbon from the pool of carbon dioxide that readily exchanges with the atmosphere. Next, please. Now, seaweed biomass has a quick turnover rate, meaning that thalli senesce or die, and the fixed carbon locked in their bodies can be released back into the previously mentioned pool of carbon dioxide and equilibrate with the atmosphere again. Research in the recent years has shown, though, that prior to this occurring, any occasional turnover, that dissolved and particulate organic compounds are readily released from seaweeds at such great rates, considering live seaweeds, that is, that potentially large portions of even up to 35%, what the research has shown, of this fixed carbon is exported to the deep ocean. And as you see in the image here, in the arrow down the slope of from the coast to the depths of the ocean, where it now has a chance of being sequestered. So this is the mechanism by which seaweeds can naturally export carbon to depth for proper sequestration, in addition to simply, like I previously mentioned, seaweeds dying and the whole thalli sinking to the bottom. Next slide, please. So it is important to specify the meaning of the terms removal, storage, and sequestration. Removal is the process of drawing down inorganic carbon and removing it from the atmosphere and surface water. Storage implies that the recently removed carbon has been biologically fixed and stored in biomass or sediments. Sequestration, on the other hand, means that post removal, carbon reaches a sink, say by sinking to the bottom of the ocean, at depth, that is, and doesn't resurface to the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. The exact threshold is still being debated in the scientific community. Some recent papers that I've been reading are pushing it more towards the millennia scale, but that's why there's such a big range there. Seaweed have not been historically well accounted for as the blue carbon contributors that they are, due to the complexity of tracking this pathway of carbon, from removal to storage to sequestration. Next, please. So we see that seaweed are removing and sequestering carbon in meaningful quantities naturally, but since the global carbon problem cannot solely be solved by reducing carbon dioxide emissions, a keen eye has been placed on seaweed as a tool, and increasing their marine carbon dioxide removal capacity. So the following are the principal pathways that have been proposed and explored within the scientific community to do this. The first being protecting and restoring wild seaweed forests. This has probably one of the biggest impacts on biodiversity protection, and also has a lot of fishery benefits. Additionally, scaling up aquaculture efforts, both near shore and offshore, is another pathway. This results in additional biomass that can be turned into products to offset emissions and serve as really useful products as well for the community, from bricks to build homes, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals. There's a number of products that seaweed go into. We can also sink biomass to the deep ocean for sequestration, assuming the location is conducive. There's a lot of research that still needs to go into this. There are concerns that sinking entire seaweed thalli will significantly disrupt nutrient cycles, which is why some efforts currently are focusing on sinking seaweed-derived carbon-rich compounds to avoid excessive nutrient depletion at the surface. Next, please. So here I'll talk about some recent work currently being done to assess the ways in which pelagic sargassum aquaculture can result in increased carbon removal and sequestration. The benefits of pursuing open ocean seaweed aquaculture as compared to coastal is that it doesn't interfere with the busy exclusive economic zones of the world where space is limited, ecosystems are critical, and it is largely too shallow for export to depth for sequestration at scale, that is. Sequestration does happen here, but we're talking about scale since we need to remove a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Open ocean habitat is certainly not void of life or traffic, but when critically assessing the least risky locations for seaweed aquaculture, the open ocean offers large areas and access to depth where sequestration can occur. Next slide. So, in my most recent role as algophysiologist, scientist, I built out the aquaculture lab at an early stage startup company who's developing a technology using seaweed aquaculture as a tool to sequester, hopefully, scalable quantities of carbon in the deep ocean. They're still in the R&D phase. So, to determine the suitability of our species and to understand their potential for scalable aquaculture, a lot has to happen. And that looks like, my team having to test various aquaculture systems. Since we worked with buoyant species that haven't developed a working aquaculture system yet. But we ran numerous experiments to find their radiance, temperature, nutrient uptake, and storage ranges and optima, which is required in order to develop some technology like this. We progressed from ex situ wet lab studies to mesocosm flow through systems and are preparing for field trials as well. So the work is interdisciplinary, working with other molecular biologists, biochemists, photobiologists, et cetera. And the extent of the R&D truly depends on how much research has already been done on the species. Next slide. As I just hinted at, there are issues with seaweed as a tool. So, research gaps still exist for effective taxon specific culturing methodologies. Measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV, development needs to occur simultaneously with restoration and culturing efforts so that effective sequestration can be truly verified. Seaweed do take carbon out of the water and not the air. And it actually takes a very long time for results to be measurable in the atmosphere as those changes in carbon dioxide concentrations in the water equilibrate with the atmosphere. So, this is a caveat to obtaining the fruits of your labor in this industry. There are ecosystem effects associated with aquaculture efforts, such as decreased productivity of plankton due to competition with seaweed for nutrients. Oxygen concentrations are projected to change across the oceans due to open ocean aquaculture, that is. And that means that at the seafloor, we could see decreases because of the biomass degradation in those scenarios. But at the surface, oxygen concentrations are projected to increase in some areas. So we'll see shifts there across the board. And then there is very little policy at the state and federal level that facilitates quick implementation of seaweed R&D efforts for climate change mitigation projects. In my recent role that I was just mentioning, I experienced waiting more than 2 years for an aquaculture permit at the state level. And we obtained one of the first, if not only, permits for a particular seaweed taxa in Puerto Rico, even though they are prominent around the island and a topic of great interest within the past 2 decades. So this certainly isn't a bash on our very important regulatory bodies, but it's a discrete example where communication and collaboration of both scientists and regulators, and obviously a lot of other individuals, is key to making sure scientifically sound and promising solutions are pushed forward in a timely manner, so we can look for solutions in this area. Next slide. So I guess just finishing up here, takeaways from this seaweed aquaculture industry for promoting biodiversity, but specifically for sequestering carbon. Scientists, we know nothing comes easy, so we must use our best research findings to date. our best oceanographic and atmospheric models. A lot of this seaweed aquaculture, has been done for smaller scale uses, but we rely on models to really project what effects are going to be in the future, alongside accurate financial and energetic budgeting, because you have to have money to fund these projects. And using all these tools to create risk assessments of a diverse portfolio of seaweed based carbon dioxide removal techniques so that we can effectively use them as tools for MCDR moving forward. Next slide. And that is it from me. I've dropped my email here. I'm not currently associated with an official organization, hence the personal email, but feel free to contact me with any questions or interests in collaborating. Thank you very much.
Questions? Well, we have time for questions at the end. Thank you very much. Our next presentation is by Jillian Walcott.
Thank you, Martin, and good morning to all. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of the panel discussion for providing the opportunity to share some of the work that the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies, CERMES, has been doing with regards to tackling the sargassum crisis that we have been facing throughout the wider Caribbean region. Now, CERMES is a small department within the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados, and I am a lecturer in tropical and coastal resource management at CERMES. Next slide. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about pelagic sargassum, and thanks to Ellie for the great introduction, so I don't have to spend much time here. But I just want to highlight the fact that when we're talking about the tackling of sargassum, I'm referring to the pelagic sargassum. So as was indicated, those are species that spend their entire life cycle afloat and never attached to the seafloor. And within the wider Caribbean, this comprises a mixture of 2 or possibly 3 sargassum species as indicated on the slide. Now, the Sargasso Sea, which most of us are probably aware of, located in the Atlantic Ocean and deriving its name from the vast patch of free-floating sargassum, was originally believed to be the original source of the influxes that we have been getting within the Caribbean region. However, studies have indicated that the North Equatorial Recirculation region, which is also known as the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, is the source of these large quantities of sargassum that we have been experiencing within the Caribbean region. And it's believed that this source area and the proliferation of sargassum is really being driven by climate change. So increasing sea surface temperatures, along with the land-based sources of nutrients, as well as high nutrient flow from river outputs such as the Amazon and the Orinoco rivers in South America, which significantly influence us here in the Caribbean. Next slide. So the sargassum in the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, as was indicated before, it consolidates into these large mats and windows and is then transported by ocean currents towards and throughout the Caribbean region. Now, as Ellie alluded to, at sea and offshore, sargassum is really a very important ecological ecosystem. It offshore, it provides refuge from migratory species. It's an essential habitat for more than 100 species of fish, more than 100 species of invertebrates, and it provides an important nursery habitat that provides shelter and food for endangered species such as sea turtles and for commercially important species such as tunas. So as outlined in the infographic, in the Caribbean, species such as the mahi-mahi, or the dolphin fish, the gray triggerfish, sea turtles, and seabirds all utilize these important habitats. Next slide, please. The problem, when we talk about the crisis that we are tackling, it really refers to the various impacts that result from the movement of these large quantities of sargassum into nearshore environments and onto our coasts. So that is within our beaches, waterways, harbors, and ports. And here in the Caribbean, these influxes and inundations have been occurring since 2011, with significant influxes also being seen in 2014, 2015, 2018, 2022, and at this point in time, what seems pretty much as an annual event. So it seems like something that is here to stay that we definitely have to be able to manage and to deal with. Next slide. So once these large quantities of sargassum gets into our nearshore environments and onto our coasts, into our ports, into our harbors, they provide a significant amount of threats. Ultimately, these influences affect our ability to achieve sustainable development as it impacts our environment, it impacts the economies, and it impacts the social aspects as well. So sectors which we are heavily dependent on in the Caribbean, such as fisheries and tourism, have been significantly impacted. Commercially important species, endangered species, and critical habitats, such as coral reefs, seagrass beds, and sandy beaches, have all been impacted from these influxes in various ways. And it also poses a public health issue because the hydrogen sulfide produced while the sargassum is decaying on the beach has actually led to an increase in respiratory illnesses. Asthmatics, for example, have been having a lot more attacks as a result of the foul odor that emanates from rotten sargassum. Next slide. So I just included this slide to give some numbers that have been put towards some economic values that have been put towards dealing with the sargassum threat. And I would just highlight the slide or the component of it that estimates an economic cost of US 120 million and needing more than 100,000 people to actually tackle the sargassum issue. So it really speaks to the social economic and the economic impact that sargassum has been having on the region. Next slide. So what has been CIRMI's response? As a Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies, CIRMI's has been at the forefront of the fight against sargassum. Second only probably to Mexico within the region, we have definitely been leading that fight. As an academic institution and a research institute, we have thus conducted a wealth of research on various areas with respect to sargassum. So looking at the biology and ecology, so associated fauna, looking at the governance and management aspects, and also looking at the potential opportunities that can be had. So one of our primary focus or areas of focus is trying to communicate sargassum science and innovation to regional stakeholders and practitioners so that we can have a joint approach to dealing with the crisis. Next slide. We recognize that not everyone obviously is interested in journal articles, and we also wanted to have tangible on-the-ground impacts. So in addition to those peer-reviewed articles stemming from a lot of the research, we've also worked quite extensively to develop various user guides, best practices, and different monitoring protocols. So on the slide, you can see some examples of some of these, where we're incorporating technologies such as drone to assist with sargassum monitoring, being able to monitor on the beach, monitor species, monitor biodiversity, and having an overall toolbox that can be utilized as well. And as you can see in the bottom middle, we've also produced best practices that cater to specific user groups such as Fisheries, within the Caribbean region. Next slide. In addition to the various publications, we've also embarked on we've made a number of presentations at various fora. These include at national, regional, and also international levels, providing a wealth of information on varying aspects related to sargassum. So looking at some of the issues that have been elucidated with respect to management, looking at the ways forward, opportunities, bringing in sargassum into the context of blue economy, which a lot of us in the Caribbean are moving towards, and also looking at forecasting and modeling of sargassum as well. Next slide. In addition to that, Fisheries has also brought together some of the top natural and social scientists from across the university with key stakeholders in the Caribbean tourism, business, and fishery sector to discuss sargassum seaweed phenomena invading our region's beaches and threatening our economic sectors. So we had our first symposium in 2015. This was followed by our second symposium in 2018. And then more recently, we had our third symposium in 2023. And for each of these things, I provided the links at the bottom so you can go and actually get more information about the events, the publication, and the work that we have been doing. Next slide. Keeping in line with our mandate of communicating the latest sargassum science, we also recognize that we need innovative ways to tell the stories. If we are going to actually cater to the various stakeholders from the general public up to the decision makers, we need to have tailored communication products. And one of the things that we also did is to develop story maps. So unique ways of telling stories around different issues with respect to sargassum. So for example, when and where. So that ties into our forecasting, looking at monitoring protocols and training courses, how to cope and adapt, and how do invasions impact coastal stakeholders. So being able to bring the issue, the challenges, the opportunities to various stakeholders in a different, unique, and impactful way. Next slide. Of course, with the influxes, one of the questions that you always get is when and where. And so Fisheries has embarked on forecasting, and that has been led by Professor Hazel Oxenford and Dr. Carl Payne. And we're pleased that we now produce a sub-regional sargassum outlook bulletin. And the bulletin primarily provides medium range, so roughly 3 months, island scale forecasts of sargassum influxes into the Eastern Caribbean based on validated transport models from the new source region, so the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. And it also provides comments on sector-specific implications for tourism and fishery stakeholders, and provides summaries and links to the latest sargassum papers and innovations. So you would actually see on the screen, we have the sargassum outlook for April to July of this year. And as you can see, overall, the sargassum outlook is somewhere between moderate and severe. So we are expecting significant amounts of sargassum as we've been seeing in the past. Next slide. Of course, we've also recognized that this is a regional issue. We've sought to establish collaborations and partnerships, and one of the most prominent of those was the development of our SARG Adapt project, or Sargassum Adapt project. And it was a project of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund ecosystem-based adaptation facility with financing coming from the International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety through KfW. And the ultimate goal of the project was to reduce the impacts of and improve adaptation to sargassum influxes in the Eastern Caribbean, with emphasis on converting a climate-linked ecosystem hazard into an asset that supports opportunities for socio-economic development. So the project worked with the project countries shown on the screen: Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, and Barbados as well. And the key components were to try to mobilize knowledge, to try to build capacity, and to develop adaptation plans to help within the region. Next slide. Stemming from this project, we were able to host a webinar which focused specifically on the social sciences, so recognizing the importance and the connection of the environment, the ecological with the social. So it looked at sargassum social science in the Caribbean, and it focused on contributions, challenges, and the way forward. Next slide. Also stemming from this project, we were able to work with the project countries to develop these sargassum adaptive management strategies, or SAMs. So you see, for each country, we had an original volume, and we've been able to update those volumes so that countries are able to put in place and develop these adaptive management strategies to be able to cope and to deal with the sargassum influxes that we are now seeing. Next slide. So looking forward, we recognize that now that we recognize it seems to be here to stay, there's a shift in focus with respect to sargassum, potentially looking at opportunities. So using it as raw materials in areas such as biofuel, fertilizers, animal feeds, specialized food dishes, healthcare, paper, fabric arts, building materials, carbon sequestration, and the like. So CERMES intends to continue with our work. One, looking at the at-sea, so doing a lot more research with respect to the at-sea harvesting of the sargassum. Also looking at the characterization of the sargassum to ensure that we find the best uses for it. Looking at valorization, so being able to build out on the value-added products. And more importantly, improving our forecasting. So our forecasting model at present is primarily looking at the offshore, but we really want to move our forecasting to the nearshore to be able to identify exactly where and when mats of sargassum or quantities of sargassum will impact certain areas along the coast to allow for better mitigation measures to be put in place. Next slide. So these are just some of the references that were included in the presentation. I also included our sargassum reference repository, so a list of useful articles, journals, documents with respect to sargassum. Next slide. And it would be remiss of me not to highlight the scientists that have been doing a lot of the work, a lot of the heavy lifting with respect to the various aspects of sargassum, the ecology, the biology, the governance, the management, the social aspect. So I just wanted to highlight these persons. Next slide. And then finally, just to say thank you. I would be happy to answer any questions, and I place my email on the title slide in case you want to reach out to me after. So thank you.
We have
Thanks,
time for a
Ian.
question.
Yeah, I have a question. How has the sargassum arrival been so far this year?
Right now we're actually starting to see mats. So at CERMES, we actually overlook the southwest coast, and we are getting inundations of sargassum starting to happen. There's also a Facebook group that was established, and so throughout the region, we're also starting to see different countries throughout the region starting to be impacted by sargassum already. And as shown from the bulletin, we do expect that the period between April to July, we will have moderate to severe influxes of sargassum throughout the region.
One other question? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next talk is by me, Martin Posey, a professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Among my projects, I do quite a bit of work on faunal use and buzz of three main mosquitoes as you're in that canoe floating through the marsh. Okay, just a quick introduction to some of our southeastern salt marsh habitats. A key is that they're highly variable. Often you'll take a look at a salt marsh and sort of just see sort of uniform vegetation kind of area, but they vary along a salinity gradient, and they also exhibit significant zonation, which will be important as we talk about restoration in some of the coming slides. Typical of a southeastern salt marsh is up high. You get various a wide diversity of plants such as sea oxeye, pickleweed, which has got variations around the world. We have sometimes black needle rust, juncus. Move down to the lower elevations, it becomes much less diverse. You have salt marsh hay, Spartina patens, and then you move into the typical cordgrass that you see here. That is what most people think of as southeastern salt marsh. It generally goes down into the mid-intertidal, can vary somewhat from area to area. Something that's very important, we often don't think about, but we'll talk is important for restoration, is that a healthy salt marsh has a distinct set of structures. You have the main channels coming through. This is your main point of ingress, egress for animals, fishery species, but also is extraordinarily important for the sediment dynamics within the marsh systems. You often have a berm that's made up of, for example, of a taller form of cordgrass, sometimes other species. You can see it nice and clearly in this particular picture from North Inlet. You have your interior marsh, and then also you'll have areas of diebacks or ponds in the back marsh, which is your more senescent areas and pools, which are important for a variety of waterfowl, and we'll be talking about that more in just a few minutes. This is just a few pictures of some of our local salt marshes. They can vary, like within the sort of very tall grass. I should note that this particular grass, this happens to be Phragmites, is about 12 feet tall. So it gives you some idea of the areas. This is a National Estuarine Research Reserve in North Carolina. You can see some of the landscape can be very sinuous, have lots of edge. Another area here where it's primarily cordgrass, showing the extensiveness of it. This is just showing in a high erosive area how I can sort of set up these peat banks that are very resistant to erosion. And this picture is just a area photograph within one of the marsh systems near Wilmington, just showing you the wide variety and diversity of grasses that can make up the marshes. You can have black needle rust, juncus, you can have Spartina, our sort of native grasses, Phragmites. This particular one is a color enhanced picture. You can see the sort of elevated berms, some of the back areas. These can be very complex structures, and for restoration, that becomes an important issue. So why are we interested in coastal tidal marshes? One, they do act as a filter, particularly in terms of filtering material coming from the upland areas as they go in through these sort of smaller rivulets. They can often be, materials can be incorporated in the sediment and then flushed out with a major hurricane or other event. They baffle waves. They can be important in reducing erosion, and increasingly living shorelines are making use of creating marshes. They are a food source, although the tidal pathway, a lot of the energy is lost, but salt marsh systems have very high microalgal production, leading to supporting extensive invertebrate populations. There's increasing interest in their carbon sequestration ability within the peat areas. Fisheries habitat, a variety of species use marshes, such as our blue crab, the most important fishery in several southeastern states. They'll use these habitats as nurseries for juveniles. And very importantly, aesthetic recreational reasons. Many people are very interested in preserving marshes for this aesthetic component. just seeing this broad green area, canoeing, kayaking, as well as for cultural services. However, the kinds of services that a marsh may provide will vary with topography, that complex nature of a marsh. For example, fisheries habitat. Most of your juvenile fish that are and decapods or finch, crabs and shrimp that are important fishery species only use the first 1 to 5 meters of the marsh. So you have an extent, if you do a restoration, for example, as an extensive, vast marsh with very little channelization in it, it will not serve very well as a nursery habitat. Rather, this area, which is a natural marsh near Wilmington, gives you that idea of the high edge to interior ratio, which is sort of optimum for many of these fishery juveniles. Waterfowl, on the other hand, often we utilize these senescent, these sort of pond areas that you no longer have the connection to inflow of sediment, and they sort of subside. Those will often be very important for waterfowl. And in some areas, we do restoration or we preserve marshes for that purpose. For reducing erosion, such as down here, a fringing marsh without channels is obviously preferred. And then carbon sequestration may be enhanced, where you have large back areas that don't continually allow the movement of sediment out of the marsh. So different types of marshes will have different functional values. Okay, some of our threats to tidal marshes in the southeast, but actually throughout much of the world. There are natural cycles of growth and senescence. Marshes, as they build up around the channels, will have natural sediment starvation in the back, and then you'll get sort of blowouts and it'll reform. So there are natural cycles, and there's natural erosional and depositional processes. But a series of anthropogenic threats are also having a major effect on our marshes. Upland development can impact the sediments coming into the back of the marsh, both by increasing and decreasing. Also, upland inputs such as herbicides. As you have marshes in increasingly suburban or urban areas, that becomes a unintentional major source of mortality. Water quality, particularly if it's sufficient to actually reduce growth at the front of the marsh. Sediment budgets, erosion from human activities. Ecosystem impacts. Shown here is this large dead area of marsh. This is actually attributed to reduction of blue crabs, which have led to the increase of some smaller marsh crabs that then destroy the marsh. As we have fisheries effects, we're also seeing increased indirect effects on the marsh themselves. We don't think of the marshes as having a lot of direct impacts from fauna, but they can. In many cases, those are somewhat masked. Dredge and fill, invasive species, and then climate change. And here I'll talk to the question of, in a few minutes, of whether marshes might be able to keep up or successively retreat with climate change. The southeastern areas have not suffered as dramatic a marsh destruction as some other areas of the world, but there are still predictions that we could lose 1/3 of our marshes in the southeastern area by 2060 through a variety of these effects, possibly also compounded significantly with climate change. So management. One, obviously the best approach is preservation of our existing marshes. In the United States, we do have quite a few regulations protecting marshes from direct dredging or filling. The regulations are present, but sometimes the damage occurs and the person, it's already done before it's caught, or sometimes there's just exceptions and other buts. Protected areas. We have the Natural Estuarine Resource Reserve System in North Carolina. We have 4 components of this system. This shows one near Morehead City, central part of the state, where we preserve some very pristine marsh areas that are major sources of research on marsh dynamics and long-term marsh change and growth. Management of water quality, of course, is a key aspect. And then marshes in turn affect water quality and use of upland buffers. But we are trying to restore marshes, particularly in areas where we've had consistent or long-term loss. So talk a little bit about the restoration and creation of tidal marshes. We have a series of examples of success. In my next slide, I'm going to go through a few of those in more detail. We have found it's generally easier to restore the plants than the animals. In the Southeast, we're good at actually putting out the plants again. But if you do long-term studies of the fauna, they don't follow until the sediment itself equilibrates over time. And so you may get a marsh that looks high functioning, but it may actually be decades before the fauna come in, as the sediment has to develop into that peat that so many of these species are acclimated to for the animals. In restoration, you generally have to design for function. For example, if you're doing it in erosion control, obviously it's a very dense nearshore area. This is an area in North Carolina where they're actually establishing oyster reefs and then establishing marsh area behind it. Fisheries is often a major aspect for restoring marshes because that's where a lot of the funding comes from. There, you're interested in highly channelized marshes, maximizing edge while still maintaining stability. There has been specific efforts to restore marshes for waterfowl, in which case it's a very different design, and as well as simply marshes that are just blocking areas. Issues related to restoration is creation of suitable topography. This has often been done in dredge-spar islands or else requires considerable heavy equipment work. With issues of planting versus allowing natural recruitment, and planting tends to be what is preferred more recently because there are many nurseries within the Southeast that grow Spartina cordgrass for restoration. And in some cases, if you're sediment starved, using like thin layer deposition. This is done extensively in Louisiana, where their heavy berms have led to die off of marshes. Let's get to a few examples. This one up here is in Poplar Island. It's in Maryland. You can see the Chesapeake Bay here. There's Annapolis. Baltimore's a little further up, so it's mid-bay. It's an island area that has eroded over time. And in fact had eroded down to just 50 acres. They're doing a 4,000 acre restoration. This is done by the Army Corps of Engineers. Is part of a use of beneficial dredge material project. And this particular marsh has been designed specifically for fisheries habitat. It's done in a series of blocks where they actually have allowed us to, over time, working with them to test some designs in terms of what really does maximize fisheries utilization. And you see here just one block. This is about a 50 to 80 acre block. It is created basically from simply a shallow water area that had formerly been eroded island. You can see it's got that sort of telltale characteristic engineering of everything symmetrical. I'll leave it at that. But lots of channels. So you're coming in here, you'll see he's got these channels coming off. Yeah, I'll leave it on the symmetrical. But anyway, it's a high edge area. And this is something that's designed more primarily for fisheries habitat. This is more of a waterfowl design with a large lake, sort of pond system within it. They all have connections that had been kicked out after the marsh was restored, and all of them were planted. This marsh here, you're seeing it only 8 to 10 years after establishment. It has fully established vegetation. It has now it's now been about 20 years, and we're seeing the full fish community beginning to come back. This case, we're talking about the mummy chogs, the smaller fish that utilize sort of prey on up to white perch, striped bass, those sorts of things in an estuarine area. So this example here of a very extensive, very successful marsh area, but this kind of restoration is not cheap. It was worth it because it saved money in having to take dredge material all the way to the mouth of the bay. Some other examples, this incidentally just shows some of the planting in some other areas. Another example, this is in North Carolina, North River Farms. This is an area where they had previously diked and drained a marsh habitat. Over time, the soil became tired. You also began to get a little salt seepage into the soils back in the agriculture area. And so the farms are now being restored back in steps to original marsh type. So this is an example of where we've gone from abandoned farmland and we're gradually in pieces restoring the hydrology and restoring that marsh coming back. Once again, the techniques for restoring the vegetation and hydrology are there. It's not an inexpensive process. This is one in Wilmington itself. This is actually the schematic of the final project, but they've actually pretty much completed it now. This is the battleship North Carolina. It had a problem that we were now having about 2/3 of the days of the year high tide flooding within the parking lot. Rather than try to build large berms to try to keep the flooding from happening, in this particular case, there was a sort of a debris area that had been left over from the original battleship being placed where it was, and they excavated the material from that, moved it into the parking lot, and then purposely turned this into a functioning marsh that could be used also as an educational component to the battleship itself. The battleship is one of the major tourist areas within North Carolina. A lot of school groups visited it as part of their curriculum study. And now there is a functioning marsh that can be used as an outdoor educational laboratory. We've actually planted the Spartina this year. First time the geese came through, ate of the Spartina. And so we've replanted the Spartina. And hopefully the geese have moved on. But once again, this shows some of the approaches and techniques that are being done and some of the application. One of the questions is whether or not this restoration really will have any long-term value. The restoration is bringing back some of what has been lost. We are restoring some of the destroyed marshes or impacted marshes. And so the question, will this be a nucleus for expansion with sea level rise, or will it simply be drowned in 30 to 40 years? This is predicted in terms of what will happen by 2050. This comes from NOAA, as you can see right down in the US, just NOAA. And this is their basic predictions based on sea level changes and tidal amplitudes that are predicted over the next 25 years. In green are areas that will become suitable for salt marsh that are currently now terrestrial areas. The area I mentioned before, the North Farms that had been diked and drained and turned into a farm and now is being returned to a marsh, is actually located right in this area here. The southeastern part of, the Pamlico Sound area of the state is very low, and it will create areas in which marshes can retreat. So created marshes may be forming a nucleus that will allow us to move back. Other areas where you have a much steeper topography, you're probably going to lose considerable areas where marshes can occur. So with sea level rise, there are areas with the restoration that restoration can be a nucleus moving backward. And just I'll end with this. This Salt Marsh Action Plan is online. I know we're ending our time, so I won't go through it much, but in 2024, we got both nonprofit, governmental, and other groups together, and we have developed an overall action plan, which is designed to advance conservation restoration, facilitate migration, which is a major issue, that as these marshes retreat, that we have the corridors for them to retreat to, rather than if you just restore a marsh in a pocket that's going to be drowned, it's a short-term solution. And then educational and other components. Well, being aware of time, that's fairly quick. Any questions? Okay, I think it's been a great pleasure to be able to talk about some of these exciting areas. Marilyn, I don't know if you want to say any closing words. I see it is 11 o'clock now. Marilyn, did you want to add anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. And like I said, this was recorded, so it will be available on the City of Wilmington site for an indeterminate amount of time. Sometimes I move some of those items to the Sister Cities Vimeo account, but not right away. So it was a very diverse panel, and so the subject matter was different, although there was a little bit of crossover. And my one concern, I know, Martin, some of these projects, the one in Maryland, I'm wondering about the funding and how much of an obstacle that was or will be in the near term, because there's so much to be done.
They, in terms of the funding, well, that particular project, funding was not an issue because it was Army Corps, dredging had to happen. And it was cost effective to use it to create the marshes. It was not contaminated sediment, at least by their best measures. And so it was really just a major cost effective effort by a required project. Some of the other projects though, yeah, the funding may become limited. Some of those things are, funding is an issue potentially. Some of them are, once again, mitigation projects. So the funding's really in response to some other action and mitigation has to happen. Other ones are more pure restoration.
And Martin, are you seeing any increases throughout recent times in private funding or, you know?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
The part of the projects up north in the county, and also some of the project funding for the cattle ship, which is somewhat privately funded. It gets some state funding, but a lot of it's private funding. We are seeing increasing private funding for some of these projects locally. They're visual, people can see the outcome. People are interested in using the marshes for recreational purposes. And so there definitely is funding coming in. The funding coming in though is more for smaller scale restoration as opposed to large scale, which is many millions. But you know, a smaller restoration like the battleship, that project was only a few $100,000. Sounds like a lot, but it's not a huge amount.
Interesting.
Well, thank you again to everybody, and I hope you'll continue to dialogue with each other now that you've met and represent both different areas of science, but different geographies. So there's a lot we can learn from each other. So keep the dialogue going, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a
Thanks.
pleasure.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
You too. Bye.
Well, appreciate it.